Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling, well, a truly massive piece of history. We're going to examine the entire story of the Cold War.
It's a huge undertaking, 40-plus years that really shaped the world we live in now.
Exactly. And our mission here isn't just to, list dates and events. We want to dive deep into the sources, really get into the why behind it all. What were the core arguments, the ideologies, the security fears that drove the superpowers?
That's the crucial part, I think. Understanding it not just as a war with armies, but as this enormous decades-long ideological battle. You had capitalism, championed by the U.S. and the West, versus communism, pushed by the Soviet Union and the East. Two totally different ways of seeing the world.
And because direct war between them became, well, unthinkable after nuclear weapons came onto the scene, the fight played out everywhere else.
Oh, absolutely. Proxy wars, the arms race, piling up terrifying weapons, propaganda wars, spies everywhere, the space race, even psychological warfare. It seeped into everything.
So we're going to trace that whole arc from Stalin and the end of World War II, right through the scariest moments like the Cuban Missile Crisis, all the way to Reagan, Gorbachev, and the eventual collapse of the Soviet system.
We'll be looking at the logic behind the big turning points, why Berlin got divided, why the wall went up, what Chernobyl revealed, the reasoning behind the strategies.
Okay, let's get into it. Where do we start? It has to be with the ideas, right? The fundamental clash of ideologies that made this whole thing almost inevitable, long before 1945. Let's talk about the birth of communism.
Right. You have to go back to the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution, amazing technological leaps, steam power, new machines, huge potential. But someone like Karl Marx looked at it and saw a massive problem baked in from the start.
He saw all this new wealth, this capital, being generated. But at whose expense?
Exactly.
Yeah.
His critique was all about that disparity. The factory owners, the capitalists, they owned the means of production, the factories, the tools, and they got incredibly rich. But the workers, the proletariat, they were just selling their labor for wages that barely kept them alive.
And the conditions were brutal, weren't they? Long hours, dangerous work, terrible poverty, poor health.
Grim reality, according to the sources. For Marx, this huge gap between the exploiters and the exploited, it couldn't last. It had to lead to revolution. The workers would inevitably rise up.
And the promise was, well, pretty powerful, especially if you were one of those workers.
Oh, incredibly powerful. The idea was to replace capitalism with communism, a system based on common ownership, no more private factories or land hoarding, the means of production shared by everyone. Eventually, Marx argued the state itself wouldn't even be needed, and those extremes of wealth and poverty, gone. Eliminated.
Kind of an economic utopia almost.
That was the vision, the final stage of human development, supposedly.
But turning that theory into practice, that's where things got complicated and violent. Russia's the key example, right?
Yes. Russia was unstable for decades. Then World War I just shattered the old order. That led to the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, led by Vladimir Lenin. And he didn't set up a workers' paradise. He set up what they called the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Which in reality meant
a ruthless one-party state, total control by Lenin and the Bolshevik Party.
And they moved fast to secure that control. The sources show they weren't messing around.
Not at all. Their security logic was absolute control. They nationalized the whole economy, private capital, gone. Outlawed all other political parties. They set up a secret police, used terror, propaganda, whatever it took, and military force to secure their borders. By 1922, this all gets formalized as the USSR, the Soviet Union.
So right from the start, you have this system built on total party authority, no private property. It's a direct challenge and existential threat to everything the Western liberal democracy stood for. Hashtag take its B, the flaws of the West and Stalin's success.
And while the Soviets are building this internally repressive system, capitalism in the West wasn't exactly looking perfect either. It had some deep, visible flaws, which actually gave the communist argument a lot of weight around the world.
How so? What were the main vulnerabilities?
Well, for one, many leading capitalist nations were still huge colonial empires. That directly contradicted the democratic ideals, the self-determination they supposedly believed in.
Yeah, hard to preach freedom while ruling colonies.
Right, and economically, markets were unstable, there was protectionism, price fixing, and then the biggest failure. The major capitalist powers had just fought World War I, tearing Europe apart. It looked like the system itself was prone to self-destruction.
President Woodrow Wilson tried to fix it after the war, didn't he? With the League of Nations promoting free trade. Self-determination.
He did, a grand vision. But it failed almost immediately and spectacularly. His own country, the U.S., refused to join the League of Nations.
Wow. That's damning.
It really was. Empires continued, then the global economy completely cratered in the Great Depression, mass unemployment, misery across the West, and the League utterly failed to stop the rise of fascism, which led straight into World War II.
So the 1930s picture for the West is pretty bleak. Political hypocrisy, economic collapse, another world war looming. Now contrast that with the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin. He's projecting this image of success.
Apparent success, yes, and that's a critical distinction. The cost was horrific, but mostly hidden. Internally, Stalin was using forced collectivization, political purges, the Gulag system with slave labor, even orchestrating a famine that killed millions, maybe 10 million or more.
But the outside world didn't see most of that.
Not really. What they saw was rapid industrialization, transforming a poor agricultural country into a modern industrial power, and crucially, while the West was suffering through the Great Depression with millions out of work.
The Soviet Union claimed full employment.
Exactly. They seem to have solved the economic problem. They built the industrial might that eventually was strong enough to push back the Nazis during World War II. That visible success, that apparent stability and progress, it made communism look like a credible alternative. It fueled communist parties and support across the West. People were desperate, and the Soviet model from the outside looked like it worked. ###C, divergent wartime experiences.
Okay, so that brings us right up to World War II, the conflict that forces these two fundamentally opposed systems into a temporary, uneasy alliance against fascism.
Yeah.
But their experiences in that war were so incredibly different, pretty much guaranteed the alliance wouldn't last.
Could be more different. For the Soviet Union, the war was just utter devastation, fought mostly on their own land. The numbers are staggering. 27 million Soviet citizens dead.
27 million. It's almost impossible to grasp that scale.
It is. Infrastructure obliterated, industry destroyed or hastily moved, farmland ruined, just catastrophic loss.
And this incredible suffering bred a really deep suspicion in Stalin, particularly towards his Western allies. What was his main grievance?
He constantly pushed Britain and the U.S. to open a second front in Western Europe, to take some pressure off the Red Army, which was bearing the brunt of the Nazi war machine. But the Allies delayed and delayed, finally landing in Normandy only in 1944.
Stalin didn't see that as just a logistical challenge.
No. Our sources indicate he saw it as a deliberate, cynical move by the West. He believed they were happy to let the Soviets bleed, to let Germany and the USSR destroy each other, weakening both. He saw it as proof the West cared little for Soviet lives. That deep, deep mistrust was baked in by the end of the war.
Meanwhile, the American experience, it was almost the opposite. Not devastation, but prosperity.
Pretty much. U.S. casualties were around 400,000, which is terrible, of course, but compared to the Soviets, less than 2% of their losses. And U.S. economy. It didn't collapse, it boomed. GDP nearly doubled during the war. Unemployment basically disappeared. The U.S. came out of the war as the world's undisputed economic powerhouse, literally financing the Allied war effort.
But something did change dramatically for the U.S. psychologically. Pearl Harbor shattered the old isolationist mindset, didn't it?
Absolutely. That attack proved that oceans weren't protection anymore. Hostile powers with modern technology bombers then, maybe missiles later, could hit the U.S. homeland. So isolationism wasn't just a preference anymore. It was seen as dangerous, an existential risk.
So the U.S. realized it needed a permanent global presence to protect itself.
Yes, to shape a stable, capitalist world order that would prevent hostile powers from rising again. So you have these two clashing post-war needs. The Soviets demanding a buffer zone of controlled states for their security, and the Americans demanding global engagement and open markets for theirs. Fundamentally incompatible visions, the stage was set for division.
Okay, so the war ends, the common enemy is defeated, and immediately these incompatible visions clash. The U.S. and the USSR move to secure their interests, but their ideas of security are just poles apart. This leads directly to the division of Europe, the Iron Curtain, #A, competing post-war security goals.
The U.S. vision was shaped by the failures that led to WWII. They wanted collective security, hence the United Nations. But just as important, maybe more so, was economic stability. They set up the Winning Bank and the International Monetary Fund, the IMF.
The idea being?
To rebuild the global economy, stabilize currencies, promote free trade, basically create a global system built on capitalism, believing that economic interdependence would prevent future wars.
How did Stalin view these new international institutions?
He joined the UN, sure, but he flat out rejected the World Bank and the IMF. He saw them, probably correctly, as tools to promote American capitalist influence globally. For Stalin, security wasn't about cooperation or economics. It was about raw power and control over territory.
Which translates directly into his vision for Eastern Europe.
Precisely. He needed a buffer zone. That meant installing loyal pro-Soviet governments in all the countries the Red Army had liberated: Poland, Hungary, Romania, etc. A physical barrier against the West. And part of that security meant keeping Germany, their historic enemy, weak. No strong German military and massive reparations to cripple their economy.
This fundamental conflict really comes into sharp focus when FDR dies and Harry Truman becomes president. The sources say Truman was much tougher, far less willing to give in to Soviet demands.
Yeah, Truman had none of FDR's maybe optimism about cooperating with Stalin. He saw Stalin as a tyrant, pure and simple, and Stalin's actions in Poland really sealed that view.
What happened in Poland?
During the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, the non-communist Polish Home Army rose up against the Nazis. The Red Army was right outside the city, and they just stopped. They waited. They let the Nazis crush the uprising and kill the Polish leadership before they moved in.
A calculated move to eliminate political rivals.
Absolutely. Cold-blooded realpolitik. For Truman, that proved Stalin couldn't be trusted, that his promises meant nothing. Compromise seemed impossible. ####B, the atomic factor, and the Iron Curtain.
So this distrust hangs heavy over the Potsdam Conference in July '45. And the first major outcome is they divide Germany.
Right. Germany and Berlin itself split into 4 zones: US, British, French, and Soviet. It was presented as a temporary measure, but it was a massive failure of cooperation. Instead of governing Germany together, they carved it up. That pretty much guaranteed Europe would be divided too.
And soon after, Churchill makes his famous speech saying an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
A powerful metaphor for a stark reality. And right there at Potsdam, Truman tries to use a new weapon to gain leverage. He casually tells Stalin about the successful test of the atomic bomb.
Trying to intimidate him, show him who's boss now.
Exactly. He thought the U.S. nuclear monopoly would force Stalin to make concessions in Eastern Europe.
But it completely backfired, didn't it? Because Stalin already knew.
He did. Soviet spies had deeply penetrated the Manhattan Project. Klaus Fuchs and others fed Moscow information for years. So when Truman revealed the bomb, Stalin showed no surprise. He knew it was coming, and his own scientists were already racing to build one. The intimidation attempt failed completely.
But the bomb did give Truman leverage elsewhere specifically, ending the war with Japan unilaterally. The decision to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was that purely military, or was the Cold War already a factor?
The sources suggest it was definitely both. Yes, it was to force a quick surrender and avoid a costly U.S. invasion of Japan. But critically, it was also about denying Stalin a role in post-war Japan. A swift end meant the Soviets wouldn't have time to invade Manchuria and claim influence like they did in Germany.
So it ensured Japan's future would be shaped only by the U.S.
Exclusively. It was a demonstration of American power and a clear signal to Moscow. Stay out of our sphere in the Pacific. An early move in the geopolitical chess game. ###C, the launch of containment.
Wow.
With the war over, Stalin immediately started testing the boundaries. He delayed pulling troops out of northern Iran, trying to set up puppet states, and put pressure on Turkey for control of the Turkish Straits, a vital waterway.
And Truman pushed back.
He did. He took the Iran issue to the new UN, and he sent the U.S. Sixth Fleet to the Mediterranean as a show of force over Turkey. Stalin backed down. This success seemed to prove that firm resistance could work.
And that leads directly to the Truman Doctrine.
Yes. In 1947, Truman announced aid to Greece and Turkey, who were facing communist pressures. But it was bigger than that. He framed it as a global struggle between freedom and totalitarianism. This formalized the U.S. policy of containment.
Let's unpack the core logic of containment.
Yeah.
The idea wasn't necessarily to roll back communism immediately, right? It was more long-term.
Exactly. The thinking, largely shaped by diplomat George Kennan, was that the Soviet system had inherent flaws: economic inefficiency, political repression. If the U.S. could just contain Soviet expansionism, prevent it from spreading further, eventually the internal contradictions would cause the Soviet system to weaken and collapse on its own. It was a strategy of patience, pressure, and vigilance.
But the fear of communism wasn't just about Soviet armies marching across borders. There was a real fear of internal subversion in the West, too.
Oh, absolutely. You had huge communist parties in places like Italy and France, with millions of members. In Italy, the Communist Party got 2.3 million members at one point, a genuine political force. There was a credible fear that communists could take power through elections or internal revolution, aided by Moscow.
And that fear fueled the Red Scare in the U.S., the era of McCarthyism.
Right. Senator Joseph McCarthy led this anti-communist crusade. People in government, Hollywood writers, academics, hundreds had their lives ruined by accusations, often based on flimsy evidence, blacklists, loyalty oaths. It was a period of intense domestic paranoia. And fellows like Nixon and Reagan definitely used that anti-communist fervor to build their political careers.
This internal fear also seems linked to the creation of the CIA in 1947. And specifically, this idea of plausible deniability. What did that mean in practice?
It was crucial. It meant the CIA could undertake secret operations overseas, things that would be totally unacceptable to the American public if done openly, like rigging elections or plotting coups, but in a way that top officials, even the president, could deny knowing about it. It provided political cover for morally gray actions deemed necessary for national security.
And their first big mission under this principle.
Italy, 1948. The Italian Communist Party was hugely popular, looked like it might win the election. The CIA secretly poured in money, millions of dollars, funded opposition parties, ran huge propaganda campaigns with letters, radio broadcasts, all to ensure the communists lost. And they did. #tag de-economic and military countermeasures in Europe.
So alongside the secret ops and the political doctrine, the U.S. launched a massive economic offensive, the Marshall Plan in 1948. What was the argument there?
Simple but powerful. Economic desperation breeds communism. If you could rebuild U.S. economies, make people prosperous, they'd be far less likely to vote for communists. So the U.S. offered about $13 billion then, which is huge money today for European recovery.
But it wasn't just charity. It came with conditions.
Oh, yes. It encouraged economic cooperation, free markets, breaking down trade barriers, basically rebuilding Western Europe and America's capitalist image. And it worked incredibly well. It fueled decades of growth.
But Stalin saw it as, what, economic warfare?
Pretty much. He saw it as a tool to lure Eastern European countries into the Western orbit. He forbade any country in his sphere of influence from accepting Marshall Plan aid. This created a stark economic divide, mirroring the political one.
And this economic split reinforced the clash over Germany. The West realized a revived German economy was key to Europe's recovery, but Stalin insisted on keeping Germany weak.
Total opposite goals. This led the Western Allies to start planning for an independent West German state. Stalin saw this as a direct threat.
So he consolidated his own control in the East.
Absolutely. He created the Cominform in 1947, the Communist Information Bureau. Sounds harmless, but it was really about enforcing strict obedience to Moscow throughout the Eastern Bloc, purging anyone suspected of disloyalty. And then came the hammer blow in Czechoslovakia in 1948.
The Prague coup.
Yes. The communists, backed by Moscow, seized total power, eliminating the last democratic government in Eastern Europe. It sent a chilling message. Moscow would not tolerate deviation.
Which brings us to the first major flashpoint, Berlin. Stalin reacts to the West German plans by blockading the city.
In June 1948, yes. Berlin was deep inside the Soviet zone, an island of Western influence. Stalin cut off all road, rail, and canal access, hoping to starve West Berlin into submission and force the West to abandon their plans for West Germany.
But Truman didn't back down.
No. He ordered the Berlin airlift. For almost 15 months, American, British, and French planes flew nonstop missions, delivering food, fuel, everything West Berlin needed to survive. It was an incredible logistical feat and a huge propaganda victory for the West. Stalin eventually had to lift the blockade in May 1949.
And this whole crisis solidified the division.
Absolutely.
Well.
Soon after, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, and the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, were formally established. Two Germanys. Two Europes.
And the final piece of the puzzle?
Yeah.
A formal military alliance for the West.
NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, formed in 1949. U.S., Canada, Western Europe, all pledging mutual defense. An attack on one is an attack on all. That was the clear military line drawn against any potential Soviet aggression. The division was complete.
Okay, so Europe is divided, the lines are drawn, NATO is formed. But the Cold War wasn't just a European affair. It quickly spread, especially to Asia, where the collapse of old empires created a power vacuum. #A containment challenges in Asia.
World War II really shattered the prestige of the European colonial powers in Asia. They'd been defeated or weakened by Japan. This unleashed a huge wave of nationalism across the continent.
The U.S. initially seemed supportive of independence, right? Like in the Philippines and India.
They did. But things got really complicated really fast, especially after 1949. That's when Mao Zedong's communist forces won the Chinese Civil War.
The fall of China. That was a massive shock to the West.
Huge. Suddenly, the world's most populous nation was communist. And Mao's model revolution based on peasants, not industrial workers like in Russia, seemed very relevant to other poor agricultural nations emerging from colonialism. When Mao signed a treaty with Stalin, it officially extended the Cold War battlefield deep into Asia.
And this immediately created a dilemma for the U.S. in places like French Indochina, what later became Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia.
Right. The independence movement there was led by Ho Chi Minh. He was a genuine nationalist figure, but also a committed communist with ties to Moscow. So the U.S. was torn: support independence, which aligned with their ideals, or support the French colonial power to prevent a communist takeover.
And containment won out.
It did. Truman chose to back the French puppet regime in the South with military aid. Meanwhile, Mao and Stalin recognized Ho Chi Minh's government in the North. Mao even sent weapons and advisors, so you had the classic proxy war set up right from the beginning.
One superpower backing the colonial power, the other backing the communist-led independence movement.
A recipe for prolonged conflict, definitely. #B, the Korean War, the first military test of containment.
And the first actual military test of containment came just a year later in Korea. Korea was divided after WDI, like Germany at the 38th parallel, Soviet-backed North, U.S.-backed South.
Both sides led by pretty brutal dictators, Kim Il-sung in the north and Syngman Rhee in the south, and both were obsessed with reunifying the country under their own rule. The U.S. had actually withdrawn most of its troops, thinking Korea wasn't strategically vital.
But then Kim Il-sung invaded the South in June 1950. Why did Stalin approve this? He'd been cautious before.
The sources suggest Mao's victory in China emboldened him. He saw an opportunity, the U.S. seemed disengaged, he gave Kim the green light.
And why did the U.S. react so strongly, sending troops back in under UN flag, if they initially thought Korea wasn't vital?
It was seen as a direct test. Was this Stalin probing? Was it a challenge to the UN's authority? Most importantly, it triggered the domino theory fear.
Ah, yes, the domino theory. Explain that logic again.
The belief was that if one country in a region fell to communism, its neighbors would inevitably follow, like a row of dominoes. So if Korea fell, maybe Japan would be next, then the Philippines. The political leadership in Washington felt they had to draw the line somewhere, and Korea was it. The political cost of not acting seemed too high.
So the UN forces, mostly U.S. troops led by General MacArthur, pushed the North Koreans way back, almost to the Chinese border.
Right, but that provoked China. Mao, fearing a U.S. presence on his border, sent hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops pouring across the Yalu River.
Turning the tide again.
Completely. They pushed the UN forces back, leading to this brutal stalemate roughly around the original dividing line, the 38th parallel. The war dragged on until an armistice in 1953.
What was the outcome? Millions dead, right? And the border barely moved.
Over 2 million deaths, maybe more.
Yeah.
A horrific cost for essentially returning to the status quo. But the war set some really important precedents.
Such as?
Well, first, it kind of proved containment could work militarily, that direct aggression could be stopped, albeit at great cost. But second, and maybe even more critical for the future, it established that nuclear weapons were off the table for these proxy wars.
Truman refused to use them, even when MacArthur pushed for it.
Staunchly refused. He even fired MacArthur partly over that disagreement. The line was drawn very clearly. Nuclear weapons were the ultimate deterrent, yes, but too devastating, too world-altering to actually use in these limited regional conflicts. That was a hugely important decision. #C, the nuclear arms race accelerates.
Speaking of nuclear weapons, the U.S. monopoly ended in August 1949. The Soviets tested their own atomic bomb. How did that change the game?
It kicked the arms race into high gear. Suddenly, it wasn't just about having the bomb, it was about having more bombs and better bombs.
And Truman's response was immediate escalation.
Yes. In January 1950, he announced the U.S. would develop the hydrogen bomb, the H-bomb, or thermonuclear bomb. Theoretically, thousands of times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Japan. The fear was, if the Soviets got the super bomb first, the balance of terror would tip decisively in their favor.
And the reality of this new weapon became terrifyingly clear with the Castle Bravo test in 1954.
That test was a shock. The yield, the explosive power, was 15 megatons, way more powerful than they predicted. But the really scary part was the radioactive fallout. It spread much farther and wider than expected, contaminating a Japanese fishing boat hundreds of miles away, killing one crewman, and spreading detectable radiation literally around the globe.
So it wasn't just the blast anymore, it was the long-term poisoning of the planet.
Exactly. Castle Bravo forced everyone to confront the fact that a full-scale H-bomb war wouldn't just destroy cities, it could have catastrophic, unpredictable global environmental consequences. The power was becoming almost too big to comprehend, let alone use rationally.
Yet the next U.S. president, Eisenhower, who took office in '53, seemed determined to integrate nuclear weapons more fully into U.S. strategy. How did his thinking differ from Truman's?
Eisenhower's New Look policy was really about deterrence through the threat of massive retaliation. He argued the best way to prevent nuclear war was to make it clear that any Soviet aggression, even conventional, could be met with an overwhelming nuclear response from the U.S.
Prepare only for all-out nuclear war. That sounds incredibly risky.
The logic was that if the consequence of starting any war was guaranteed total destruction, then no rational person would ever initiate one. It was also seen as more cost-effective. Relying on the bigger bang for the buck of nuclear weapons meant you could potentially reduce spending on expensive conventional armies and navies.
So the strategy boiled down to mutual annihilation is the safest path.
That was the grim paradox at the heart of it. Eisenhower's war plans involved targeting thousands of sites across the Soviet Union and China with nuclear weapons simultaneously. When Kennedy came into office later, he was reportedly horrified to find that this all-or-nothing plan was the only one available. The commitment to total destruction as the ultimate deterrent was locked in. Hashtag #TagTagCheg, de-Khrushchev, de-Stalinization, and Sputnik.
Let's shift back to Moscow. Stalin dies in 1953. After a power struggle, Nikita Khrushchev emerges as the new leader. What were his first moves?
He consolidated power pretty quickly. He formalized the Eastern Bloc military alliance by creating the Warsaw Pact in 1955, a direct counterweight to NATO. He also reorganized Stalin's brutal secret police into the more professional but still feared KGB.
But then he did something completely unexpected, the secret speech in 1956.
That was revolutionary. At the 20th Party Congress, Khrushchev stunned everyone by openly denouncing Stalin's crimes, the purges, the terror, the personality cult. This launched a policy called de-Stalinization, trying to, reduce the level of absolute terror, decentralize some power, allow a bit more internal debate.
Did this give people in Eastern Europe hope for real change?
Oh, absolutely. In Poland, there were riots, and they actually managed to negotiate more autonomy from Moscow. Statues of Stalin came down across the bloc. There was a definite sense of a thaw.
But that thaw had very clear limits, as Hungary discovered later that same year.
Tragically, yes. Inspired by de-Stalinization, Hungarians rose up demanding multi-party democracy and, crucially, announcing they were leaving the Warsaw Pact and seeking UN protection.
How did Khrushchev respond?
Ruthlessly. He showed the limits of his reforms. He sent the Red Army tanks rolling into Budapest to crush the uprising. Thousands were killed, or wounded, estimates say around 20,000, and the leaders were rounded up and executed.
So the message was, internal reforms, maybe, but challenging Soviet control over the bloc, absolutely not.
Unmistakable. The Brezhnev Doctrine was foreshadowed right there. Moscow reserved the right to intervene militarily to keep socialist countries in line.
While Khrushchev was cracking down militarily, the Soviets achieved something that sent shockwaves through the West. Sputnik.
Yes, a massive technological and psychological victory. First, in August 1957, they tested the world's first successful intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM. Then, just a couple of months later, they used a modified version of that same rocket to launch Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, into orbit.
It wasn't the satellite itself that was the threat, though, was it? It was the rocket that got it there.
Exactly. The ICBM proved the Soviets could now potentially hit the United States mainland with nuclear weapons. Before that, the U.S. had felt relatively safe behind its oceans. Sputnik shattered that sense of security.
It caused panic in the U.S., right? The missile gap fear.
Huge panic, fear that the Soviets were technologically superior, that the U.S. was falling behind. It led directly to the creation of NASA, massive investment in science education, and fueled the intensity of the space race. It wasn't just about getting to the moon. It was about proving who had the better rocket technology, the better delivery system for nuclear warheads, a major propaganda win for Khrushchev.
So by the late 50s, early 60s, we have this nuclear stalemate in Europe. The lines are hardened. The space race is on. Where does the conflict go next? It seems to shift focus, right?
#J. The third world is the new focus.
Exactly. Both sides started looking more towards what was then called the Third World, the non-aligned nations, many of them newly independent former colonies in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, often poor, often unstable.
Why the shift? What were the interests there? For the U.S., a lot of it was about resources. Access to raw materials, especially oil from the Middle East, which was crucial for Western economies. Strategically, they wanted to prevent these countries from falling into the Soviet orbit. For the Soviets, it was fertile ground for ideology, exploiting anti-colonial resentment, supporting revolutionary movements, gaining allies, and strategic footholds.
And this is where the CIA really ramps up its activities, isn't it? The sources mention huge increases in personnel and budget in the early 50s.
Tenfold increase in personnel, budget skyrocketing.
Yes. The CIA became a primary tool for fighting the Cold War in the Third World, often covertly. Using that principle, we talk about plausible deniability.
To do that, exactly.
To influence politics. Sometimes that meant funding friendly politicians or media. Other times it meant actively working to overthrow or even assassinate leaders who seemed too left-leaning, too friendly to Moscow, or who threatened Western economic interests. This leads to the blowback argument, actions taken for short-term gain that have disastrous long-term consequences. Can you give some specific examples?
Iran in 1953 is a classic case. The democratically elected Prime Minister, Mossadegh, nationalized the British-owned Anglo-Iranian oil company. Big threat to Western oil interests.
So the CIA
orchestrated a coup. They got rid of Mossadegh and installed the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He was pro-Western, an autocrat, ruled with an iron fist for decades. But that intervention bred huge resentment among Iranians against the U.S.
A resentment that eventually exploded in the 1979 revolution.
Directly. The overthrow of the Shah, the U.S. Embassy hostage crisis, a lot of that anger traces right back to the 1953 coup. Short-term win, long-term disaster, blowback.
And Guatemala in 1954, similar story.
Very similar. President Jacobo Arbenz tried to implement land reforms that threatened the interests of the powerful American-owned United Fruit Company. So the CIA backed a coup, overthrew Arbenz, and installed a military dictatorship that was much more friendly to U.S. business, but deeply unpopular and repressive.
Yeah. And the Congo in the early 60s, targeting Patrice Lumumba.
Lumumba was the first democratically elected prime minister of the independent Congo. He sought aid from both sides, including the Soviets, which made Washington nervous. The CIA saw him as potentially unstable, possibly leaning communist. They were involved in plots against him. Eventually, he was overthrown and murdered, replaced by the pro-Western dictator Mobutu Sese Seko.
It seems like the U.S. was often contradicting its own stated ideals of democracy in these interventions. How did officials justify supporting these dictators? Was there internal debate about this?
There absolutely was internal debate, but the dominant mindset, especially under Eisenhower and early Cold War figures, was that the communist threat was so total, so existential, that preventing any country from falling into the Soviet sphere justified almost any means. The argument often boiled down to, a pro-American dictator is bad, yes, but a Soviet-aligned communist state is infinitely worse and poses a direct threat to U.S. survival.
So the immediate goal of containment trumped the long-term goal of promoting democracy.
In many of these cases, yes. The perceived necessity of stopping communism allowed for a kind of moral compartmentalization, where supporting undemocratic regimes was seen as the lesser of two evils in the grand struggle against the USSR. #tag Be Suez and the end of empires.
But it wasn't just the superpowers manipulating things. Some third world leaders got pretty good at playing the game themselves, right? Like Nasser in Egypt.
Gamal Abdel Nasser was a master at playing the superpowers off against each other. He got the U.S. initially interested in funding the massive Aswan High Dam project,
while simultaneously buying weapons from Czechoslovakia, a Soviet bloc country.
Exactly. When the U.S. eventually pulled the dam funding, partly because Nasser recognized communist China, Nasser didn't just fold. He turned around, got Soviet funding for the dam instead, and then hit back at the West by nationalizing the Suez Canal in 1956.
The canal was vital for international shipping, largely British and French controlled. How did they react?
They freaked out. Britain, France, and Israel coordinated a secret plan and invaded Egypt to seize back the canal.
But this time, the U.S. didn't back them.
No, Eisenhower was furious. He hadn't been consulted, and he saw it as old-school colonialism that would alienate the entire Arab world and push them towards the Soviets. He condemned the invasion, threatened Britain with crippling economic sanctions.
And Khrushchev chimed in, too.
He did, rattling his rockets, threatening missile strikes against Britain and France. Caught between U.S. pressure and Soviet threats, Britain and France were forced into this incredibly humiliating withdrawal.
What was the significance of that moment?
It was really the nail in the coffin for Britain and France as independent global powers. They couldn't act without U.S. approval anymore. It boosted Nasser's prestige immensely across the Arab world, and it solidified the U.S. view that they needed to be the dominant Western power in the Middle East, leading directly to the Eisenhower Doctrine, promising U.S. aid to any Middle Eastern country resisting communism. #, see Berlin Wall and the embarrassment of communism. Okay, back to Europe, and specifically Berlin. John F. Kennedy comes into office in 1961. Young, relatively inexperienced, Khrushchev sees an opportunity.
He tries to bully him at their Vienna summit.
Yeah, Khrushchev basically reissued Stalin's old ultimatum. West Berlin is deep in East Germany. It's unnatural. The Western powers need to get out. He tried to test Kennedy's resolve.
How did Kennedy respond?
He refused to budge. He gave speeches about defending Berlin's freedom, increased the U.S. defense budget significantly, even started a program promoting fallout shelters in the U.S., signaling he was prepared for the possibility of nuclear confrontation over Berlin.
But behind Khrushchev's bluster, there was a serious problem for the Soviets and East Germany and Berlin, wasn't there?
A massive problem. Brain drain. Since 1949, nearly 3 million East Germans had fled to the West, and the easiest way to do it was simply to cross from East Berlin into West Berlin. These weren't just random people. Often they were the youngest, the best educated, the skilled workers that East Germany desperately needed.
So West Berlin was like this escape hatch, constantly draining the East German state and making communism look bad.
Exactly. It was a huge economic drain and a massive propaganda embarrassment. A prosperous, free, capitalist city thriving right in the middle of communist territory. Khrushchev and the East German leader, Walter Ulbricht, felt they had to plug that hole for the GDR to survive.
Since Kennedy wouldn't give way politically, Khrushchev took direct action.
In August 1961, literally overnight, they started building the Berlin Wall. Barbed wire first, then concrete. Eventually, it became this massive fortified barrier 12 feet high, stretching nearly 100 miles, complete with watchtowers, armed guards, minefields, the whole works.
A brutal, physical symbol of division.
And a powerful symbol of communist failure. As Kennedy famously put it in his Berlin speech, freedom has many difficulties and democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in. It stopped the flow of refugees, yes, but at the cost of looking desperate and repressive. #JVD. The Cuban Missile Crisis.
The closest call.
The wall stabilized the situation in Berlin, but just over a year later, the world comes closer to nuclear annihilation than at any other time. Cuba. The stage was set earlier. Fidel Castro's revolution in 1959 overthrew a U.S.-backed dictator. Castro nationalized American businesses, looked for Soviet support. Eisenhower hit back with the trade embargo. The CIA started plotting ways to assassinate Castro.
And they trained Cuban exiles for an invasion.
Yes, which led to the Bay of Pigs disaster in April 1961, shortly after Kennedy took office. The CIA-backed invasion failed miserably within days. It was a huge embarrassment for Kennedy.
And how did Khrushchev read that failure?
He saw Kennedy as weak, indecisive, someone who could be pushed around. He also felt Castro needed protection from future U.S. attempts. This calculation led him to make an incredibly risky move in 1962.
Sending nuclear missiles to Cuba. What was his justification?
He publicly framed it as defensive to protect Cuba. Privately, and maybe more importantly, he saw it as balancing the scales. The U.S. had nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy right on the USSR's doorstep. He said it was giving the Americans a little taste of their own medicine, but strategically, placing medium and intermediate range missiles in Cuba dramatically increased the threat to the U.S., doubling the number of Soviet warheads that could reach American cities, and cutting the warning time down to minutes.
U.S. spy planes discovered the missile sites under construction in October 1962. How did Kennedy's team react?
Intense debate. Some advisors pushed for immediate airstrikes or an invasion. Kennedy opted for a less direct but still confrontational approach. A naval blockade or quarantine around Cuba to prevent more missiles from arriving.
And the world held its breath. The U.S. military went to DEFCON 2, the highest level of alert, short of actual war.
It was unbelievably tense. 140,000 U.S. troops gathered in Florida ready to invade. Strategic Air Command bombers were in the air, 247, carrying nuclear weapons. Both sides were staring into the abyss for 13 days.
And during this standoff, there was one specific incident involving a Soviet submarine that sources say brought us terrifyingly close to the brink.
Yes, the incident with submarine B-59, it was near the blockade line. U.S. Navy ships were dropping small, non-lethal depth charges, signaling for it to surface. The submarine captain, cut off from communication with Moscow, thought war might have already started. He wanted to launch the sub's nuclear torpedo.
Launching that would have undoubtedly started a nuclear war.
Almost certainly. Soviet protocol required 3 officers on board to agree to launch. The captain and the political officer agreed. But the 3rd officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. He argued against it, insisted they surface first. His refusal, his single act of dissent under immense pressure, very likely prevented World War III right there.
Incredible. How was the crisis ultimately resolved?
Through back-channel negotiations, Khrushchev eventually agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba. In return, the U.S. publicly pledged not to invade Cuba, and privately, the U.S. agreed to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey and Italy, a concession Khrushchev needed to save face.
What were the long-term consequences of surviving this crisis?
Several major ones. First, the immediate installation of the hotline, a direct communication link between the White House and the Kremlin, to prevent future misunderstandings escalating so dangerously. Second, it really solidified the terrifying doctrine of mutually assured destruction, or MAD.
Let's dig into MAD a bit more. The idea, pushed by figures like Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, was that planning only for total civilization-ending war was the safest option. How did that work?
It sounds completely counterintuitive, right? But the logic of MAB was based on making nuclear war unwinnable for both sides. To ensure this, you had to guarantee that even if one side launched a surprise first strike, the other side would still have enough surviving nuclear weapons to retaliate and inflict unacceptable damage, basically, destroy the attacker's society.
So vulnerability was key. You actually wanted the other side to know they couldn't survive starting a war.
Exactly. It meant abandoning traditional military targeting, hitting missile silos or army bases first. MAD required targeting the enemy's cities, their population centers, to guarantee maximum casualties. The goal was to make the cost of starting a nuclear war so horrifically high, the complete annihilation of your own country, that no sane leader would ever contemplate it.
Did they ever consider alternatives, like limited nuclear war options?
They were discussed, yes, the idea of using smaller tactical nukes on a battlefield without it automatically escalating. But planners like McNamara largely rejected this. They argued that once you cross the nuclear threshold, any use of nuclear weapons would inevitably spiral out of control into all-out strategic war. Human decision-making under that kind of pressure would break down.
So MAD, despite its horror, was seen as the most stable, if terrifying, form of deterrence.
That was the conclusion they reached. It removed ambiguity. And it led directly to things like the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile ABM Treaty, where both sides agreed not to build nationwide missile defense systems. Because if one side thought they could defend themselves, it might tempt them to launch a first strike. MAD required both sides to remain horrifyingly vulnerable to each other. That vulnerability became the cornerstone of nuclear peace for decades.
Surviving Cuba seems to have shifted things. While the nuclear standoff solidified, the next major phase sees the catastrophic failure of containment in Vietnam, and surprisingly, a major split within the communist world itself. #gigantium, the failure of containment in Vietnam.
Right. Vietnam divided at the 17th parallel after the French defeat in 1954. The U.S. backed the South, led by Ngo Dinh Diem, against the communist North, led by Ho Chi Minh. And for U.S. policymakers, that domino theory we discussed, it was basically gospel by this point.
If Vietnam falls, all of Southeast Asia falls. That was the unwavering belief.
Absolutely. It drove escalating U.S. involvement. But the Diem regime in the South was incredibly corrupt, repressive, and unpopular, especially with the Buddhist majority. It got so bad the U.S. actually backed a coup against him in 1963, which resulted in his assassination.
Which probably didn't help stability.
Not at all. President Lyndon B. Johnson then dramatically increased U.S. military commitment, pouring in troops over 500,000 at the peak and launching massive bombing campaigns. He believed overwhelming American firepower would inevitably crush the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong insurgency in the South.
But it didn't work out that way.
No. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were incredibly determined, fighting on their home turf, using guerrilla tactics effectively. The U.S. military machine got bogged down in a seemingly unwinnable war.
And public support back home started to crack, especially after the Tet Offensive in 1968.
Tet was a turning point. The communists launched this huge coordinated surprise attack across South Vietnam, even hitting the U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon. Militarily, it was costly for them, but psychologically, it shattered the narrative the U.S. government had been selling.
The narrative that the war was almost won, There was light at the end of the tunnel?
Exactly. Tet proved the enemy was far from defeated, still capable of massive operations. And because Vietnam was the first television war, people saw the brutal reality, the fighting, the casualties in their living rooms every night. This created the infamous credibility gap, a deep mistrust between the public and the government's pronouncements about the war.
This fueled massive anti-war protests in the U.S.
Huge protests. Campuses erupted. A whole generation became politicized against the war, seeing it as immoral and pointless. 1968 was just a year of turmoil, Tet. The assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy. The country felt like it was tearing itself apart.
Richard Nixon comes into office promising peace with honor, but the war drags on. He even expands it secretly.
Yes, ordering the secret bombing and later invasion of neighboring Cambodia to try and cut off enemy supply lines. This expansion sparked even more protests, leading to the tragedy at Kent State University where National Guardsmen killed 4 students.
Eventually, the U.S. does withdraw its troops in 1973. What happens then?
The fragile South Vietnamese government collapsed quickly. North Vietnam took over the entire country in 1975. Saigon fell. The U.S. had lost.
And the cost? Human cost, geopolitical cost?
Staggering. Around 58,000 American lives lost. Estimates for Vietnamese deaths, soldiers and civilians, north and south, run into the millions. Geopolitically, containment had failed spectacularly, and the dominoes did fall. Nearby communist regimes took power in neighboring Laos and Cambodia,
Which led to the horrific Cambodian genocide under Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge.
one of the worst atrocities of the 20th century. Up to 2 million Cambodians, maybe a quarter of the population, were killed by their own government. The failure in Vietnam had devastating regional consequences. ###B, Sino-Soviet schism.
While the U.S. is bogged down in Vietnam, a major crack appears in the supposedly monolithic communist bloc. The relationship between the Soviet Union and China falls apart. What caused that?
It had been brewing for a while, but Khrushchev's de-Stalinization speech in 1956 was a key factor. Mao Zedong in China was horrified.
Why?
Mao had modeled his own rule, his purges, his cult of personality, directly on Stalin's example. He saw Khrushchev's critique of Stalin as a betrayal, as dangerous revisionism that undermined the entire communist project. He thought Khrushchev was going soft, abandoning revolutionary principles.
And Mao himself was implementing some pretty radical and disastrous policies around this time.
Oh, yes. Things like the 100 Flowers campaign in 1957, supposedly encouraging open debate, but actually a trap to identify and purge intellectuals who dared to criticize the party.
And the Great Leap Forward.
An economic catastrophe. Mao's rushed attempt at industrialization and collectivization based on completely unrealistic goals and ignoring basic agricultural science. Policies like the 4 Pests campaign, killing sparrows, which then led to insect plagues, and the Backyard Furnace campaign, where peasants melted down tools to make useless steel. It was madness. Combined with bad weather, it led to the Great Famine between 1958 and 1962.
The death toll estimates are unbelievable. 30 million.
Yeah.
40 million. Even 50 million people.
The deadliest famine in recorded history. And Mao's regime systematically covered it up, even exporting grain while millions starved. It was a colossal failure of the communist system, completely hidden from the outside world at the time.
So ideological differences, Mao's disastrous policies. How did this translate into actual conflict between the two communist giants?
Relations deteriorated steadily. They competed for influence in the communist world, hurled ideological insults at each other. It finally boiled over into actual military clashes along their shared border in 1969, a 7-month-long series of skirmishes.
Serious fighting. War seemed possible.
It did. Both sides massed troops. There was genuine fear of a full-scale war between the USSR and China.
And this split presented a huge opportunity for the U.S.
Massive. Nixon and his advisor Henry Kissinger saw it immediately. If the two biggest communist powers were enemies, the U.S. could play them off against each other. This led to Nixon's historic visit to China in 1972.
Meeting Mao, normalizing relations.
Exactly. It completely reshaped the global balance of power. It gave the U.S. huge leverage over the Soviets, who were now deeply worried about a potential U.S.-China alliance against them. The China card became a central element of U.S. foreign policy. #NoteKiss. The era of détente, easing tensions.
So the U.S. is dealing with Vietnam fallout, exploiting the Sino-Soviet split. What's happening inside the Soviet Union during this period? President is in charge now, right?
Leonid Brezhnev took over after Khrushchev was ousted in 1964, and he basically reversed de-Stalinization. Power became re-centralized in Moscow, the party bureaucracy became stifling, corruption grew. It's known as the era of stagnation.
Meaning the economy wasn't growing, innovation stalled.
Pretty much. Living standards stagnated or even declined. There was a lack of dynamism, and any attempts at reform within the bloc were crushed. The prime example is the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia in 1968.
Alexander Dubček tried to implement socialism with a human face.
Introduce reforms, ease censorship, allow more freedom. Brezhnev's response? Send in 500,000 Warsaw Pact troops to crush the movement and install a hardline regime. This established the Brezhnev Doctrine. Moscow claimed the right to intervene in any socialist country where communism seemed threatened.
So stagnation at home, repression in the bloc. Yet this is also the period known as détente, an easing of tensions with the West. Why would both sides pursue that?
Mutual need, really. The U.S. under Nixon was exhausted by Vietnam, facing domestic turmoil, and the defense budget was strained. They needed a breather, more stable relationship. The Soviets under Brezhnev were dealing with the economic stagnation, the costs of the arms race, and the new threat from China. They also needed to ease tensions to focus on internal problems and manage their empire.
So détente wasn't about friendship. It was about pragmatic management of the rivalry.
Exactly. And the first major achievement was the Saltaya Treaty in 1972, strategic arms limitation talks.
What did SALT-I actually do?
It essentially froze the number of long-range ballistic missile launchers, both land-based ICBMs and submarine-launched missiles at their existing levels. It didn't reduce weapons, but it put a cap on the quantitative arms race. It also included the ABM treaty we discussed, limiting missile defenses. It was a crucial first step in managing the nuclear competition.
And the most visible symbol of détente probably happened in space.
The Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975. After the U.S. effectively won the moon race by landing astronauts in 1969, the intense space rivalry died down. Apollo-Soyuz saw an American Apollo spacecraft dock with a Soviet Soyuz capsule in orbit. The crews met, shook hands, shared meals.
A literal handshake in space.
The ultimate symbol of cooperation. High point of détente, broadcast around the world. #D, political turmoil and accountability.
But even as Nixon is pursuing détente and opening relations with China, his administration is involved in some pretty serious abuses of power, still driven by that Cold War, contained communism at all costs mentality.
Absolutely. The secret bombing of neutral Cambodia starting in 1969 is a prime example. Nixon and Kissinger deliberately falsified records to hide it from Congress and the public.
And Chile. Nixon publicly said the U.S. wouldn't interfere with a democratically elected Marxist president, Salvador Allende.
Publicly, yes. Secretly, Nixon authorized the CIA to spend millions destabilizing Allende's government funding opposition groups, fomenting strikes, creating economic chaos. The goal was to make the country ungovernable and provoke a military coup.
Which eventually happened in 1973.
Yes, a brutal military coup led by General Augusto Pinochet overthrew and killed Allende. Pinochet established a ruthless dictatorship, responsible for torturing and killing thousands of political opponents. And the U.S. role in destabilizing Allende was undeniable.
Nixon's obsession with secrecy and enemies seems to have led directly to his downfall with Watergate, too.
It did. The leak of the Pentagon Papers, classified documents about the Vietnam War, infuriated Nixon. He created the secret plumbers unit to stop leaks, leading them to illegal activities like breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel. The cover-up attempt unraveled, forcing Nixon to resign in 1974 to avoid impeachment.
Did all this Vietnam, Cambodia, Chile, Watergate lead to any pushback against unchecked presidential power and foreign policy? Did Congress try to reassert itself?
Yes, significantly. The secret bombing of Cambodia, when finally revealed, outraged Congress. This led directly to the passage of the War Powers Act in 1973.
What did that do?
It tried to limit the president's ability to commit U.S. forces to armed conflict without congressional consent. It imposed time limits, typically 60 days for deployments without a formal declaration of war or specific authorization. It was a direct attempt by Congress to reclaim some authority over war-making that had shifted heavily to the presidency during the Cold War.
And the exposure of CIA abuses, particularly in Chile, also led to changes.
Good time. Congressional investigations like the Church Committee exposed widespread CIA activities, assassination plots, coups, domestic spying. This led to new oversight mechanisms and a growing public resistance to covert interventions. When a crisis erupted in Angola in 1975, Congress explicitly banned the secret use of funds there. That was a major shift, Congress directly blocking a CIA proxy war. Accountability was starting to creep into the Cold War consensus.
So we had this period of détente, salty Apollo-Soyuz, but it seems like it was pretty fragile. It didn't take long for tensions to ramp up again in the mid to late 70s. Hashtag, tag, détente, the erosion of détente.
Very fragile. Underlying mistrust never really went away. The 1973 Yom Kippur War in the Middle East showed that clearly. The U.S. backed Israel, the Soviets backed Egypt and Syria. Things got tense. Brezhnev threatened to send Soviet troops unilaterally as peacekeepers.
And Nixon, even though he was deep in the Watergate scandal by then,
He responded by putting U.S. nuclear forces on high alert, DEFCON 3. He warned Brezhnev that any independent Soviet move would have incalculable consequences. It was a stark reminder that the potential for superpower confrontation was still very real right beneath the surface of détente.
Brezhnev tried to keep détente alive with the Helsinki Accords in 1975, right? What was the deal there?
It was a trade-off. The West, including the U.S. and Canada, formally recognized the post-WWII borders in Europe, something Moscow desperately wanted, legitimizing their control over Eastern Europe. In return, the Soviets agreed to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms, including freedom of thought and movement.
That sounds like a major concession for the Soviets. Did it backfire on them?
Massively. Brezhnev probably thought the human rights pledges were just words. But dissident groups within the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe seized on them immediately. Groups like the Moscow-Helsinki Group formed specifically to monitor the government's compliance with the accords and publicize violations. It gave them an internationally recognized platform to criticize the regime.
So Helsinki accidentally empowered the very dissent it was supposed to placate.
Exactly. Détente became increasingly unpopular in the U.S. too. Conservatives saw it as rewarding Soviet bad behavior. President Gerald Ford, who took over from Nixon, actually banned the word détente from his administration's vocabulary.
Then Jimmy Carter becomes president in 1977. He wanted to revive détente, but also emphasized human rights. Did that work?
It ended up confusing the Soviets. Carter would push for further arms control, like the SALT II treaty, but then he'd publicly meet with prominent Soviet dissidents like Andrei Sakharov, which infuriated the Kremlin. They saw it as interference in their internal affairs. Meanwhile, the Soviet military was pushing ahead with deploying new, powerful SS-20 intermediate-range nuclear missiles aimed at Western Europe. Tensions were clearly rising again, despite efforts like SALT II, which Carter signed but the Senate never ratified. Hashtag tag B, the final break. Afghanistan.
What was the final nail in the coffin for détente? Two big events in 1979 seem crucial.
Absolutely. First, the Iranian Revolution. The U.S.-backed Shah was overthrown by Islamic revolutionaries led by Ayatollah Khomeini. Then, militants stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking 52 American hostages.
That hostage crisis dragged on for 444 days. A huge blow to American prestige and confidence.
A massive blow. And it created instability right on the Soviet Union's southern border. Then, just weeks later, in December 1979, the second event, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan.
Why did they invade? What was their rationale?
Afghanistan already had a pro-Soviet government that had taken power in a coup. But that government was unstable, facing a growing armed rebellion from Islamic Mujahideen fighters. The Soviet leadership, the Politburo, feared the communist regime would collapse, potentially leading to instability spreading into the Soviet Central Asian republics, or even worse, Washington somehow exploiting the chaos to gain influence right on their border.
So it was a defensive move, in their view, to prop up a client state.
That was their logic, preventative intervention, but the invasion was brutal and full-scale.
How did Carter react to the invasion?
He saw it as naked aggression, a blatant violation of international norms. He told Brezhnev directly this invasion could mark a fundamental and long-lasting turning point, and he backed it up.
What actions did he take?
He withdrew the SALT II treaty from Senate consideration, effectively killing it. He imposed an embargo on grain sales and high-technology exports to the USSR. He announced the U.S. would boycott the 1980 Moscow Olympics. And, significantly, he declared the Carter Doctrine,
Which stated
that the U.S. would use military force if necessary to defend its national interests in the Persian Gulf region, basically warning the Soviets away from the Middle East's oil fields. The invasion of Afghanistan completely shattered what was left of détente. The Cold War was back and arguably colder than ever. Hashtag see Reagan's peace through strength strategy.
This return to confrontation sets the stage for Ronald Reagan's election in 1980. He had a very different view of the Soviet Union and détente, didn't he?
Totally different. Reagan rejected détente completely. He saw it as weakness, as immoral accommodation with what he famously called an evil empire. His argument wasn't about managing the rivalry. It was about winning the Cold War.
How did he propose to do that?
Through peace, through strength. His core belief was that the U.S. needed to rebuild its military might and assert its dominance. The strategy was twofold. First, force the Soviets into an arms race they couldn't afford, crippling their already weak economy. Second, negotiate arms reductions, but only from a position of overwhelming strength.
So massive military buildup.
Huge. Defense spending almost doubled in his first term. New weapons systems, Trident submarines, advanced bombers, more accurate ICBMs. He deployed new intermediate-range missiles in Europe to counter the Soviet SS-20s.
And economic pressure, too, not just the arms race.
Yes, economic warfare was key. Reagan worked with Saudi Arabia to convince them to dramatically increase oil production. This flooded the world market, causing oil prices to collapse. Since oil exports were a major source of hard currency for the Soviet Union, this hit their economy very, very hard.
But the most famous, maybe most controversial, part of Reagan's strategy was SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative. Star Wars.
Right. Announced in 1983, SDI was this vision of a space-based shield that could shoot down incoming Soviet missiles using lasers or other advanced technologies, make nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete, as Reagan put it.
Was the technology actually feasible then? The sources suggest Reagan knew it was decades away, if possible at all.
Most scientists agreed it was far beyond current capabilities. But whether it was feasible wasn't really the point. The announcement itself was the weapon. It terrified the Soviet leadership.
Why, if they knew it wasn't real yet?
Because they were already lagging badly behind the U.S. in computers and advanced technology. They feared that even if SDI was a long way off, the U.S. might eventually achieve it. And if the U.S. had a defensive shield, it could potentially launch a first strike against the USSR without fearing retaliation. It threatened to overturn the entire logic of mutually assured destruction. They panicked, feeling they had to pour resources they didn't have into developing countermeasures. The bluff worked.
This renewed confrontation and Soviet panic led to some incredibly dangerous moments, didn't it? Almost accidental triggers for war.
Extremely dangerous. The Soviets, under Yuri Andropov, who briefly succeeded Brezhnev, became paranoid, convinced the U.S. might be planning a surprise attack. Their intelligence services were on high alert for any sign.
Which led to the shooting down of the South Korean airliner KAL-007 in September 1983.
Yes. The plane accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace. In the climate of high tension and paranoia, Soviet commanders assumed it was a spy plane and ordered it shot down. 269 innocent people were killed. A terrible tragedy fueled by Cold War fear.
And then just 2 months later, the Able Archer 83 incident. What happened there?
Able Archer was a major NATO military exercise. It simulated procedures for transitioning from conventional to nuclear war, including practice alerts and coded communications, even involving heads of government like Thatcher and Kohl. Critically, parts of the exercise involved radio silence.
And the Soviets misinterpreted this exercise.
They seriously feared it might be a cover for a real U.S. nuclear first strike. Their intelligence reports flagged it as potentially genuine preparation for attack. Soviet nuclear forces were reportedly placed on high alert. Some historians believe this moment, in November 1983, might have been even closer to accidental nuclear war than the Cuban Missile Crisis, simply because of Soviet misinterpretation fueled by Reagan's pressure and their own paranoia.
Reagan's strategy certainly put immense pressure on the Soviets, but the ultimate unraveling seems to come from within, with the rise of a new kind of Soviet leader. #A, the need for change. Gorbachev's rise.
Absolutely. After Brezhnev died, there was this quick succession of aging, ailing leaders, Andropov, then Chernenko. They both died within about a year. The Politburo, the ruling committee, realized they needed younger leadership, someone capable of addressing the country's deep problems. So in March 1985, they elected Mikhail Gorbachev.
He was much younger, seemed more dynamic.
Just 54. A stark contrast to his predecessors. And critically, he was willing to acknowledge the Soviet system was failing and needed fundamental reform. He wasn't initially trying to dismantle communism, but to revitalize it.
What were the main pressures forcing this need for reform? Reagan's arms race was one factor.
Definitely. The Soviet economy simply couldn't sustain that level of military spending. But another major factor, often overlooked, was the example of China.
China. How so?
After Mao died, his successor Deng Xiaoping started introducing market-based reforms, experimenting with capitalist elements within the communist system starting in the late 70s, and the results were stunning.
Economic growth took off.
Dramatically. Per capita income tripled, GDP quadrupled in about a decade. China was booming, while the Soviet economy under Brezhnev had stagnated, even shrunk in the early 80s. The contrast was becoming impossible for Soviet leaders to ignore. It showed that market mechanisms worked,
So Gorbachev introduces his own economic reform program, perestroika.
meaning restructuring. The idea was to introduce limited market incentives, allow some small private businesses, decentralize economic decision-making a bit. It was symbolized, famously, by the first McDonald's opening in Moscow in 1990. Huge lines.
But he realized perestroika couldn't succeed while locked in this incredibly expensive arms race with Reagan.
Exactly. Economic reform required cutting military spending. That meant negotiation with the West wasn't just desirable, it was an absolute necessity. Gorbachev adopted a much more conciliatory approach than his predecessors. He made unilateral concessions, like halting missile deployments, trying to build trust with Reagan.
And this new approach led to a major breakthrough in arms control.
The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces INF Treaty, signed in 1987. This was huge. Unlike SALT, which just limited weapons, the INF Treaty eliminated an entire class of nuclear missiles, all land-based missiles with ranges between 500 and 500 kilometers.
They actually destroyed existing weapons.
Over 2,500 nuclear weapons were destroyed by both sides. And crucially, the treaty included unprecedented verification measures. Both sides allowed inspectors onto their military bases to ensure compliance. It was a genuine landmark, showing real arms reduction and trust building was possible. #B Glasnost and the catalyst for dissolution.
Alongside perestroika, Gorbachev launched another key policy, glasnost. What did that mean?
Glasnost means openness. The idea was to allow more public discussion, more criticism, more honesty about the country's problems and past mistakes. Gorbachev hoped this would help fight corruption, reconnect the Communist Party with the people, and generate support for his reforms.
Was there a specific event that really pushed him towards glasnost?
The Chernobyl nuclear disaster in April 1986 was a major catalyst. The initial government response was typical Soviet secrecy, trying to cover it up, delaying evacuation, downplaying the danger. The catastrophe exposed the deep rot in the system.
Gorbachev himself said it revealed the sickness of the system.
Yes, the lies, the irresponsibility, the lack of accountability. Chernobyl made the need for openness undeniable, even to Gorbachev.
But glasnost didn't quite work out the way Gorbachev intended, did it?
Not at all. He opened the door for criticism, hoping to channel it constructively. But once the fear was lessened, the criticism exploded. Decades of pent-up frustration and anger came pouring out, directed not just at past mistakes, but at the party itself, and eventually at Gorbachev himself. He unleashed forces he couldn't control.
And crucially, Gorbachev also signaled an end to the Brezhnev doctrine. He wouldn't use force to keep the Eastern Bloc in line anymore.
That was the other critical piece. He started reducing Soviet military presence in Eastern Europe, spoke about letting each country find its own path to socialism, allowed multi-candidate elections. The message was clear. Moscow would no longer intervene militarily to prop up unpopular communist regimes. #C, the endgame.
So glasnost unleashes internal criticism, perestroika struggles, and the threat of Soviet tanks disappears from Eastern Europe. What happens next?
1989, the year everything changed. With the fear of Soviet intervention gone, reformers and popular movements surged across Eastern Europe.
The dominoes fell, but in the opposite direction this time.
Exactly. Poland held free elections. Hungary opened its border with Austria. One communist government after another was peacefully ousted. Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution, Bulgaria, East Germany. The only real violence was in Romania, where the dictator Ceausescu and his wife were overthrown and executed.
And the most iconic moment of 1989.
November 9th. The Berlin Wall came down. Guards just opened the gates amidst massive crowds. People swarmed through, climbed on top, started chipping away at it. An unbelievable emotional moment symbolizing the end of the Cold War division. Germany reunited less than a year later.
Gorbachev was celebrated in the West for allowing this to happen, but back home, things were falling apart for him.
He was losing control. Glasnost had unleashed powerful nationalist movements within the Soviet Union itself. Republics like Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia declared independence. Gorbachev abolished Article 6 of the Soviet Constitution in 1990, officially ending the Communist Party's guaranteed monopoly on power. This just fueled the disintegration.
And Boris Yeltsin emerges as a rival figure.
Yeltsin got elected president of the Russian Federation, the largest Soviet republic, and he actively pushed for Russia's sovereignty, essentially seeking to dissolve the Central Soviet Union structure.
This leads to a desperate move by hardliners.
Yes.
The August coup in 1991.
Yes. High-ranking officials, KGB chief, defense minister, others saw the USSR collapsing. They staged a coup, placing Gorbachev under house arrest while he was on vacation. They tried to reassert central control.
But the coup failed.
Failed quickly. Within 3 days, Yeltsin famously stood on a tank outside the Russian parliament building in Moscow, denounced the coup, and rallied popular resistance. The military largely refused to fire on the crowds. The plotters were arrested.
Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but his authority was gone. Yeltsin was the man of the hour.
Completely. The coup attempt fatally weakened the central government and accelerated the final collapse. Republic after republic declared independence.
End of the final act.
December 25th, 1991, Christmas Day. Mikhail Gorbachev went on television, resigned as president of the USSR, and declared the office extinct. The Soviet Union officially ceased to exist.
74 years after the Bolshevik Revolution.
That evening, the red Soviet flag with the hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time, replaced by the Russian tricolor. The Soviet Union dissolved into 15 independent states. The Cold War was over. #outro. So when you look back at this whole vast sweep of history we've covered, it really was a conflict driven at every stage by these competing ideas about how society should be organized and by fundamentally clashing definitions of national security.
Yeah, from the ideological split right at the beginning, through the security dilemmas in post-war Europe, the nuclear terror, the proxy wars fought across the globe, the temporary easing of tensions during détente, and then the final phase.
And the sources really seem to converge on this point. The Cold War wasn't ultimately decided by military victory. It ended because one system, the Soviet communist system, fundamentally failed.
It couldn't sustain the economic burden of the arms race, especially under the intense pressure Reagan applied. And Gorbachev's own reforms, like glasnost, inadvertently exposed the system's weaknesses, Chernobyl being a key moment, and unleashed forces that led to its collapse.
That seems to be the consensus from the material we've looked at, the combination of external pressure and internal systemic failure.
So looking back now, decades later, what's a key takeaway for us, for you, the listener? The INF Treaty was a success, the Soviet Union is gone. But what lingers?
Well, one chilling thought is that the core strategic logic that prevented outright war, mutually assured destruction, MAD, is still largely in place today between nuclear powers. The idea that total vulnerability is the only guarantee against nuclear war. That terrifying concept born in the Cold War still underpins global security. We're still living with that paradox.
That's definitely something to reflect on. And what about the other major theme we trace, the superpower interventions in the Third World, installing dictators, overthrowing governments in the name of containment? What's the lasting impact of that?
That's perhaps the most complex and damaging legacy. We talked about Iran in 1953, how that CIA intervention arguably paved the way for the anti-Western revolution decades later. That pattern repeated across Latin America, Africa, Asia.
Creating instability, propping up regimes that generated deep resentment.
Exactly. The short-term wins of the Cold War, preventing a country from going communist, often created long-term instability, fueled radicalism, and undermined the very democratic values the West claimed to champion. Many of the conflicts and troubled regions we see today have deep roots in those Cold War proxy battles and interventions. That shadow is long, and the world is definitely still grappling with the consequences.